On the 4th of November 2025, at 5:13 p.m. local time, a UPS McDonnell Douglas MD-11 cargo jet climbed barely 100 feet above Louisville International Airport before its left engine tore away from the wing. The aircraft, carrying 20,000 packages and 38,000 gallons of fuel, rolled inverted and crashed into an industrial complex, killing all 3 crew members and 12 people on the ground. Here's what makes this tragedy so disturbing. Boeing knew this exact failure was possible. In February 2011, the manufacturer issued a service letter documenting 4 previous failures of the same bearing that ultimately destroyed Flight 2976. They recommended inspections. They offered a redesigned part, but they concluded it would not result in a safety of flight condition. They were catastrophically wrong. UPS Airlines Flight 2976 was a scheduled domestic cargo flight from Louisville Muhammad Ali International Airport to Daniel K. Inouye International Airport in Honolulu, Hawaii, an 8.5-hour trans-Pacific haul. November 4th was a Monday evening in Louisville, the heart of UPS's Worldport hub, where the company sorts packages bound for destinations worldwide. The aircraft, registered N259 UP, was a 34-year-old MD-11F that had first flown for Thai Airways in 1991 before being converted to a freighter and delivered to UPS in 2006. It had accumulated 92,992 flight hours across 21,043 cycles and was powered by 3 General Electric CF680C2D1F turbofan engines. Weather conditions that evening were routine for early November: clear skies, light winds, good visibility. Nothing suggested operational challenges ahead. The crew consisted of Captain Richard Wartenberg from Independence, Kentucky, First Officer Lee Truitt, and International Relief Officer Captain Dana Diamond. All 3 pilots were experienced MD-11 operators, familiar with the aircraft's handling characteristics and the long Pacific crossing ahead. The MD-11 itself represented a design lineage stretching back to the DC-10 of the 1970s, a trijet configuration that had largely disappeared from passenger service, but remained economical for cargo operators. Visual inspections of the left engine pylon mounts had last been performed in October 2021, and more detailed inspections weren't yet due. The aircraft's accumulated cycles were well below the thresholds requiring those checks. From a maintenance perspective, everything was in order. Flight 2976 was loaded with cargo bound for Hawaii, one of thousands of flights. UPS operates daily from Louisville. The crew had no reason to expect that this routine departure would become one of the deadliest cargo accidents in recent U.S. aviation history. Everything looked normal, until it wasn't. The aircraft received takeoff clearance at approximately 5:11 p.m. EST. The taxi and takeoff roll proceeded routinely. Flight 2976 was assigned runway 17R, a long, concrete strip pointing south from the massive UPS Worldport facility. The MD-11's 3 engines spooled up, their combined thrust pushing the heavily loaded freighter down the runway with increasing velocity. Standard MD-11 takeoff speeds for a flight like this fully loaded with fuel for Hawaii would have put V1 around 150 knots, rotation speed near 165 knots. The crew would have called V1 as they passed the go-no-go decision point, then rotate as they reached the speed to lift the nose. The airplane rotated for takeoff at approximately 5:14 p.m. EST, but something was already catastrophically wrong. Footage circulating on social media shows the MD-11 already ablaze as it accelerated down the runway, its left engine trailing flames. The crew may not have immediately recognized the severity engine fires on takeoff, create split-second decisions about whether to abort or continue the takeoff, and deal with the emergency. Airborne. By the time the nose lifted, they were past V1. The decision was made. The MD-11's main wheels left the pavement. Airport surveillance cameras captured the left engine and pylons separating from the wing shortly after airplane rotation, with fire igniting on the left engine and near the attachment area. In the cockpit, alarms would have erupted: fire warnings, engine indications, hydraulic cautions. The crew had seconds to process what was happening. The MD-11 climbed for only a few seconds before its left engine tore free, fire trailing aft along the wing as the trijet staggered beyond the runway. When an engine mounted under the wing separates, it doesn't just create a thrust imbalance. The sudden loss of mass changes the aircraft's weight and balance. The departing engine can strike the wing or fuselage. Fire inevitably follows as fuel lines rupture and hydraulic fluid ignites. The aircraft climbed briefly, reaching no more than 30 feet above ground level. Its left main landing gear struck the roof of a UPS Supply Chain Solutions warehouse at the southern edge of the airport. That impact alone would have been catastrophic for controllability. The crew was flying an asymmetric aircraft at minimum airspeed with parts of the structure already compromised. In the cockpit, the workload would have been overwhelming. Standard engine out procedures assume the engine fails but remains attached. This was fundamentally different, a structural separation that compromised aerodynamics, created massive drag on one side, and likely damaged flight control systems. The aircraft climbed only briefly, reaching no more than 200 feet, before rolling left and crashing in an industrial area beyond the runway. The left wing struck a cluster of fuel tanks at the Kentucky Petroleum Recycling Company, triggering a massive explosion and fireball visible across Louisville. The MD-11 rolled inverted before crashing through an auto scrapyard, a truck parking lot, and an auto parts store, leaving a half-mile-long trail of destruction. From engine separation to impact, less than 30 seconds. There simply wasn't enough altitude, airspeed, or time to recover. The crash left a debris trail nearly half a mile long. The plane was reaching 200 miles per hour when it crashed shortly after takeoff, carrying up to 20,000 packages and 38,000 gallons of fuel. The impact triggered a massive explosion and fire, sending black smoke towering over the airport. The number one engine was later found lying on the grass beside runway 17R, a testament to how early in the takeoff roll the separation began. Emergency responders arrived within minutes, but the scene was already one of total devastation. Among those killed was at least one young child, making the tragedy even more heartbreaking. Flight data recorder information would later show everything appeared normal until approximately 20 seconds before the end of recorded data. The engines were performing nominally. The aircraft systems showed no warnings or failures. Then, in an instant, everything changed. The failure happened so rapidly that the crew had virtually no time to diagnose, react, or execute any meaningful recovery procedure. From the outside, witnesses described a fireball lifting off the runway, trailing smoke and debris, before rolling and diving into the industrial area south of the airport. Louisville Mayor Craig Greenberg would later describe the aftermath as unlike anything the city has seen in decades. The crash site encompassed multiple buildings, vehicles, and an active business where people were simply working on an ordinary Monday evening. The investigation immediately focused on the engine separation. How does a modern aircraft maintained by a major carrier simply lose an engine on takeoff? The NTSB arrived the next day and began the painstaking work of reconstructing what happened. Early examination centered on the left pylon aft mount, a key structural linkage that secures an engine to the wing. Theory 1 emerged quickly: catastrophic failure of the engine mount structure due to long-term metal fatigue. Investigators found fatigue cracks and areas of overstress failure in parts of the left engine mount. The spherical bearing assembly showed that the interior surface of the bearing's race had fractured surfaces around the entire circumference at the edge of the design recess groove. This bearing, a 3-inch wide metal collar that allows the engine pylon to flex independently of the wing, is subjected to immense loads during every flight. The engine's weight, thrust, vibration, and thermal expansion all concentrate stress on this component. Fatigue cracking originated around the entire circumference at the edge of the design recess groove, extending through about 75% of the bearing race thickness, with the remaining 25% failing through overstress. The fracture pattern told investigators this wasn't a sudden failure, it was progressive. Cracks had been growing through thousands of flight cycles, slowly weakening the bearing until it finally gave way during the high loads of takeoff. Theory 2. Maintenance oversight allowed a deteriorating component to remain in service. The last time those key engine mount parts on the UPS plane were examined closely was in October 2021, and the plane wasn't due for another detailed inspection for roughly 7,000 more takeoffs and landings. UPS had lubricated the pylon thrust links and spherical bearings just weeks before the crash, on October 18. Could maintenance personnel have missed visible evidence of the bearing race cracking? The failure of these spherical bearing assemblies was visually identified by observing the displacement of the fractured bearing race pieces beyond the outer surface of the lugs. If the bearing had already begun migrating from its normal position, a detailed visual inspection might have caught it. But there's a critical gap in this theory: the inspection interval itself. MD-11 maintenance schedules are based on cycle counts, pressurization cycles that stress the airframe. Special detailed inspections for the mount lugs weren't yet due, as the aircraft's accumulated cycles were well below the thresholds required for those checks. UPS was following Boeing's prescribed maintenance program. The question becomes, was that program adequate for this failure mode? Theory 3 might be the most troubling. This was a known design flaw that should have been addressed years earlier. In January 2026, the NTSB released an investigative update that changed the entire narrative. Boeing Service Letter MD-11S L54104A, dated the 7th of February 2011, informed operators of 4 previously reported bearing race failures on 3 different airplanes involving this exact part. Let that sink in. Boeing documented 4 failures of this specific bearing failures that initiated at the same design recess groove on 3 different MD-11 seconds. In the previously reported events, a total circumferential fracture of the bearing race resulted in the bearing splitting into 2 pieces, allowing them to migrate forward and aft. The service letter discussed a new configuration, spherical bearing assembly, that eliminated the design recess groove and recommended its installation when an installed bearing was found unserviceable. However, the installation of the original flawed design to replace an unserviceable bearing was not prohibited. Most critically, Boeing's review of the spherical bearing failure determined it would not result in a safety of flight condition. They were wrong. Catastrophically, tragically wrong. When I look at the totality of evidence, the failure mode is clear. A design flaw in the bearing race, known to Boeing since at least 2011, combined with an inspection interval that couldn't detect the progressive cracking. The design recess groove created a stress concentration point where fatigue cracks could initiate. Over tens of thousands of cycles, those microscopic cracks grew until the bearing race fractured completely during the high loads of takeoff rotation. What makes this especially troubling is that a solution existed. Boeing offered a redesigned bearing that eliminated the problematic recess groove. Had that part been mandatory? Had the 2011 service letter been elevated to an FAA airworthiness directive requiring retrofits, N259UP would likely have had the improved bearing, installed years ago. Former FAA and NTSB crash investigator Jeff Guzzetti noted that a McDonnell Douglas service bulletin from 1980 identified spherical bearing race failures as a safety of flight condition, making it surprising Boeing didn't use that same classification in 2011. The investigation will now scrutinize why Boeing downplayed the severity, whether UPS properly incorporated the inspection recommendations, and why the FAA never mandated the improved part. These are systemic questions about regulatory oversight and corporate responsibility. Consider what was happening in the cockpit during those final seconds. The crew likely felt or heard something abnormal during the takeoff roll, perhaps a vibration, a noise, or early fire warnings. But they were past V1, committed to flight. Standard procedure says, get airborne, climb, assess, execute appropriate checklists, except there was no time. Once airborne, the MD-11 could not climb beyond about 100 feet above ground level. It crashed about 0.5 nautical miles from the runway end into an industrial area. The loss of the left engine wasn't just an engine failure, it was a catastrophic structural separation that compromised the entire aircraft's aerodynamics and controllability. In any asymmetric thrust situation, pilots fight the yaw, the tendency of the aircraft to turn toward the dead engine, but they also need sufficient airspeed for rudder authority to counteract that yaw. Flight 2976 was at minimum safe airspeed when the engine departed. The sudden drag of the damaged pylon, combined with fire and possible flight control damage, created an unrecoverable situation. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps pilots awake. A mechanical failure so catastrophic, so immediate, that training and skill become irrelevant. The crew did not fail, the aircraft failed them. The MD-11 has a complicated history. N259. UP was built in 1991 during the MD-11's production run from 1990 to 2001. Boeing purchased McDonnell Douglas in 1997 and assumed responsibility for the continued operational safety of the former manufacturer's in-service fleet. When Boeing issued that 2011 service letter, they were managing a fleet of aging aircraft built by a different company decades earlier. Airlines quit flying MD-11 seconds commercially years ago because they aren't as efficient as newer models, but they continued flying for cargo carriers like UPS and FedEx. All MD-11 seconds that had been in use and 10 related DC-10 seconds were grounded following the crash. The FAA issued an emergency airworthiness directive effectively grounding the global fleet pending inspections. Major operators including UPS and FedEx had already voluntarily removed their MD-11 freighters from service before the FAA action. The accident shares chilling parallels with American Airlines Flight 191 inches, 1979, a DC-10 that lost its left engine and pylon on takeoff from Chicago O'Hare, killing 273 people. The NTSB notes the parallels, as the MD-11 shares structural lineage with the DC-10, and although the failure mechanisms differ, the similarities are striking. Beyond the technical failure lies a deeper question. How did a known design flaw persist for 14 years after Boeing documented it? The answer involves the complex interplay between manufacturers, operators, and regulators. Service letters are recommendations, not mandates. They alert operators to potential issues and suggest inspections or modifications, but compliance is voluntary unless the FAA elevates the concern to an airworthiness directive. Boeing's 2011 letter said there had been 4 previous failures of the bearing race in 3 airplanes that required visual inspections but did not consider it a safety of flight issue. The part would typically be inspected every 5 years. A 5-year inspection interval for a component with a documented history of fatigue failures now seems inadequate. The NTSB is now reviewing how the inspections were incorporated, how UPS utilized the contents of the service letter in its maintenance program, and what correspondence existed between Boeing and the FAA before and after the 2011 service letter was released. These questions will determine whether regulatory changes are needed to prevent similar failures. The aviation industry's safety record depends on learning from every accident and implementing changes to break the chain of events. In this case, the chain was visible years before the crash. For pilots flying cargo aircraft, especially older types like the MD-11, this accident reinforces several critical lessons. First, understand the specific vulnerabilities of your aircraft type. The MD-11's engine mount design had known weaknesses. Crews should be aware of historical failure modes and early warning signs. Second, engine failures on takeoff demand perfect execution of memory items, but structural failures that compromise the aircraft may render standard procedures inadequate. When the impossible happens, when the aircraft breaks apart, the only hope is altitude and airspeed. Everything else is secondary. Third, the decision to continue or abort a takeoff past V1 is predicated on the assumption that the aircraft will fly. If you have any indication of structural compromise, unusual vibrations, visual evidence of parts departing the aircraft, reconsider that assumption even past decision speed if runway remains. Finally, advocate for proactive safety measures. When manufacturers issue service letters about components with failure histories, operators should consider whether voluntary inspections are sufficient or whether mandatory retrofits would be more appropriate. Safety margins exist for a reason. 14 years and 4 documented failures should have triggered a more aggressive response. The crash of UPS Flight 2976 killed all 3 crew members aboard the aircraft and 12 additional people on the ground, one of whom succumbed to injuries on December 25. 15 lives lost because a small metal component, known to be vulnerable to fatigue cracking, finally failed under the stresses it had endured for 21,043 flight cycles. Captain Richard Wardenberg, First Officer Lee Truitt, and International Relief Officer Captain Dana Diamond were experienced professionals executing a routine cargo flight. The ground victims were people working at their jobs, visiting businesses, simply going about their Monday evening in Louisville. None of them had any reason to expect their lives would intersect with aviation tragedy that day. The NTSB's final report usually doesn't come until more than a year after a crash. When it does arrive, it will likely contain safety recommendations addressing inspection intervals, mandatory part replacements for aging aircraft with known vulnerabilities, and perhaps changes to how manufacturers and regulators assess failure risks. We owe those 15 people more than investigation reports. We owe them prevention. Every accident exposes weaknesses in our systems. The question is whether we'll implement the changes needed to ensure these specific failures never happen again. This channel will provide updates as the investigation progresses and final conclusions emerge. The fragility of flight demands our constant vigilance.